correct. Got it. And then I've got a 541 number that ends in 147. Can that person come off mute and let us know who you are, just so we can rename you?
Hi, it's Barb Sham at Allegheny.
Okay, thanks, Barb.
Thank you.
All right. Any questions about the agenda? All right, then I think we can go ahead and get started, Shannon, with your overview of the FMP development and how it's going.
Okay, sounds good. Let me get this in. Oops, full screen. Okay, is that showing properly? Great. Okay, so like Peter said, we wanted to start off today with just a high-level overview of progress, and then really devote a majority of the time to talking through the criteria and process for the stand level treatment allocations, and then the monitoring framework that was shared ahead of this meeting. So just looking at overall progress on FMP draft sections. This is an update to a slide that we showed at the last FMP working group meeting a couple weeks ago at the end of July. And so these were the bullet points that we had gone over. The updated sub-watershed analysis with the proposal for revised stand level treatment allocations is what we want to talk about today. And then there will also be continued opportunities to discuss further beyond today's meeting. But we really wanted to take this time to walk through that with you and answer any questions and get input. So that's today. There's also the species conservation strategy section, which includes the 3 HCP species, as well as the multi-species conservation strategy. That draft will be shared ahead of the September advisory committee meeting. So that will be shared very shortly here in August. The other section that's noted here is the adaptive silviculture for climate change draft, and that's another section that we're targeting to share ahead of that advisory committee meeting. And then there's a bullet point here on the updated framework for the monitoring plan that was shared ahead of this meeting. So we'll have a little bit of time to discuss today. And then obviously we'll be continuing to incorporate input and welcome that feedback from members of this working group and the advisory committee as we continue to update that section. And then finally, we are working on updated versions of drafts that were previously shared in July, and we'll have those ready to share ahead of the advisory committee meeting as well. So we'll be sharing sections on Friday, including incorporating feedback from today's meeting to the extent possible over the next couple of days. And then as we've talked about in the past, this is an ongoing process. So we'll continue to address input from you all in successive drafts. Additional progress on the forest management plan related to these sections and others. We're getting closer to completion of the updated forest inventory and associated database based on the 2021 LiDAR flight. Bogdan Strimbu and his group have also been doing drone and handheld LiDAR scanning on the Elliott on a subset of the biodiversity plots. And then we have continued analysis work and calibration on the landscape level models, as well as continued data collection from the teams who are working on the Elliott this summer. And then part of the recent work associated with that are alignment between the teams who are working on canopy microbiome sampling and the team that's working on microclimate sampling. So making sure that at least a subset of those plots align for this pilot season, where we have canopy sensors and then dendrometers aligned on the same trees, as well as ground-based LiDAR on those trees, and alignment with biodiversity plots where possible. So that's one of the approaches for the monitoring framework too, which we can talk about in a little bit, but it's really looking at how all of these different data collection points and monitoring systems align. And so that's part of what we're piloting this summer. So this is an image from one of Bogdan's scans on the Elliott. And he's doing this, as I said, for a subset of the biodiversity plots to get a really clear picture that can align with the data that's being collected there. And then another point of progress is taking a closer look this field season at some of the treatments that have been allocated on the landscape based on the 2015 ODF inventory data and the reallocation process that we're going through for some of those stands. So this is an example of a couple of the stands that we visited a couple of weeks ago. So on the picture up here on the left is from Sub-Watershed 68. This map may look familiar because this is what was sent out along with those stand level treatment reallocation proposals. So these are 17 sub-watersheds that the Triad Early Implementation Technical Group has identified as part of the sort of early years of implementing that Triad experiment. And so we went out and visited quite a few of these to take a closer look at the conditions on the ground and the analyses that are being done. And we'll be going back and doing additional trips to take a look at some of these other sub-watersheds. So this picture right here is an example from Sub-Watershed 68 in the southwest part of the forest. This is a stand that, according to the analysis that's been done, would be an intensive stand within this allocation here. And then over here on the right is an example of a stand we visited in Sub-Watershed 99. This is a stand that has been allocated as reserve. So this is another piece of the puzzle is going out and really ground truthing the analysis and taking a look at the current conditions and being able to wrap that into the work that's going into the forest management plan and the drafts. We're going to be talking about the monitoring plan towards the end of this meeting, as Peter said, but just wanted to give sort of a high-level overview. We have had some groups on the forest this summer. This is the Aquatic and Riparian group, members of that team. There were 2 trips down there this summer so far to take a look at some of the aquatic systems. And the discussions here really help drive the information that you saw in the monitoring framework, and that will be continuing to be developed and added to. So the main components of that monitoring plan are looking at forest inventory, including a network of permanent plots across the forest that are aligned with sampling protocols with some other sites in the Pacific Northwest as well as around the world. There are plans to do additional LiDAR, so aerial scans every 10 years, with terrestrial scans from drone and handheld LiDAR regularly. And all of that is detailed in the monitoring framework. And then there's an additional layering of forest carbon monitoring aligned with this permanent plot network. There's a section in that monitoring framework on the aquatic and riparian systems. And these are just a couple of the main areas for monitoring. This is not the full list, but looking at measurements related to water quality and quantity, stream habitat, floodplains, and wood recruitment. Oh, forest inventory got in here twice. And then climate and microclimate. The framework discusses a network of climate stations as well as additional sensors and transects across the forest using other climate monitoring tools. Another piece of this is looking at biodiversity. So there's a description in the framework of the biodiversity plots that are being piloted this summer, which include game cameras, and then set up for monitoring flying insects, ground-dwelling arthropods, soil fungi, and avian point counts, as well as bats. There are vegetation plots associated with the biodiversity plots, and there's vegetation monitoring in the riparian areas as well, associated with the LiDAR and forest inventory. There's also monitoring for microbial communities in both the soil and the canopy, as well as the macrobiome in the canopy. So there's the ability using the climate stations to actually get into the canopy and use those towers to access points across the forest, and we would be able to monitor there as well with wildlife cameras and other tools. There's also a protocol for amphibian monitoring in the framework that we're continuing to work on. There's a section, oh, yep.
Yeah, but it looks like Bob Salinger had a quick question on that piece.
Okay.
No, actually, I don't. I was going to ask you about amphibians, and I just saw it, and then you just answered it. So, anyways, you're good. Thanks.
Okay. So then another component here is the HCP species. This is obviously tied very tightly to the Habitat Conservation Plan draft. And so using that as the baseline, a lot of the biodiversity plot monitoring and other system-wide monitoring across the forest will help contribute to HCP species monitoring. And then, excuse me, there's additional compliance and effectiveness monitoring that's required on top of that. So there's a brief description there, and we'll be continuing to build this out in the framework as well. There's also a section on forest management and economics, including looking at economic impacts of the forest management, recreation, research, and education programs on local communities, workforce development, tracking impacts on infrastructure, mills, connections with the harvest inventory and the database that will be developed for the forest. And then finally, another category here is human ecosystem relationships and values. A big part of that is understanding recreation values and recreation use on the forest, as well as doing surveys to understand people's values for a research forest and for a public forest, and how those may change over time. So that's the really high overview. We'll have time at the end of this meeting to discuss any of these points that members of the working group would like to dig into, and then we'll be continuing to work on this framework and update drafts and be able to talk with you more about the details. So I guess I'll pause there to see if there are any questions before we go to the stand level treatment allocations.
Any questions from the advisory committee or comments?
I have a quick question, very quick.
Hey, Barb.
It's Barb.
Yeah. Hey, Barb. We just as a protocol for managing the conversations, we'll save the conversations during the meeting for advisory committee members, but we'll add you to the list for public comment at the end and make sure we have time for that. Thanks much. Any comments or questions from the advisory committee? All right. Thanks for the continued hard work, OSU team, and for the members of the committee providing the feedback you've been providing, and look forward to your continued review on the revised versions and next iterations of chapters as they come out. And with that, onward to the allocations.
Okay. So today we wanted to have a deeper discussion with the working group on the criteria that have been developed for these stand level treatment allocations, look at several representative sub-watersheds to talk about how the criteria were applied and what those results look like. And then once we have agreement from this group on the overall approach, then we'll be able to move on to the remaining sub-watersheds in the MRW. This is not the final stand level treatment allocations. There with incoming data, there may be additional tweaks, but this is sort of the next phase in the process of taking a closer look and applying these additional criteria on top of the stand age criteria that was used. So to review a bit of background, and this was also in the materials that were shared ahead of this meeting, we started this exercise with sub-watersheds that were identified by the early implementation triad committee. They were chosen to represent the spatial range across the forest in order to limit bias and also to minimize clumping of individual sub-watershed treatments, in addition to looking at the characteristics within each sub-watershed. So this is a design that's a replicate of 4 treatments. So you'll have in the final sort of 16 sub-watersheds, you'll have 4 extensive, 4 reserve with intensive, 4 triad E, and 4 triad I. We presented the list of criteria that were developed based on stakeholder input for the stand level allocations, consulted with the triad committee on this process, and then as I said, once we get input from this group, we'll be able to move forward with the remaining 23 sub-watersheds in the MRW. So with this analysis, we're not focusing on extensive. Since extensive sub-watershed treatments cover the entire sub-watershed, there aren't any adjustments that could be made to the treatment allocations. So it's just reserve with intensive, triad E, and triad I. So this is a snapshot again of those sub-watersheds. There are 17 right now, and eventually we'll be looking at getting down to 16. There's some discussion within the group on trade-offs between a couple of sub-watersheds to kind of get to that final number. Over here on the right, you'll see a chart that shows each of the sub-watershed numbers that were analyzed, the number of acres that were adjusted with these proposed stand level changes, and then looking at that as a percent in area of the sub-watershed changed. So you'll notice that at a maximum, it's 36% of the sub-watershed. At a minimum, it's 0. There was one sub-watershed we looked at, and in discussing all the criteria and trade-offs and the constraints that we have within the research design and managing for HCP species, there weren't at this stage any changes that we had identified. So this is a list of the criteria that were applied on top of that stand age criteria. So looking at first the integrity of the research design, the first sub-bullet point here is silvicultural suitability. We've been trying to come up with a phrase that kind of captures what this criteria is meant to accomplish. But really it's looking at the current starting conditions, the structures, the relative density within those stands, and looking at, according to the research design, which conditions we're trying to get to as desired conditions in the future, and looking at what would need to happen in order to get to those conditions. So it's looking at age, and then at all of these other characteristics that have to do with stand composition and structure. There's also a criteria looking at operational feasibility, including things such as the existing road network, and then looking at prior harvests for stands. This is an additional piece of criteria that we really want to dig into further, looking at prior stand entries. We don't have necessarily strong records of past management in many of these stands. We do have a spatial layer that has a little less than half of the stand management sales. So that's something that we want to go back and look at to see how many extensive or reserve stands may have had prior harvest entries, and just kind of understand the stand history a little bit better. And then the final bullet point here is looking at economic feasibility. There is also a bullet point here looking at northern spotted owl and marbled murrelet habitat. So this is a really critical piece, as well as looking at stakeholder concerns. Main areas of concern that we've discussed are protections for older trees, marbled murrelet and northern spotted owl habitat, scenic values, and then recreation impacts. We're also looking at head walls and steep slopes, including looking at slope stability, steepness, and shallow translational landslides. And in the materials that we shared, there is a screenshot on each of these sub-watersheds that shows slope, and that was using an 80% slope as a screen to identify the steepest of the steep slopes. And then finally, there's also a bullet point here on fragmentation and connectivity, with an aim to reduce fragmentation where we can, in looking at how these stand level treatments align with each other within a sub-watershed, and then also looking at nearby adjacent sub-watersheds as well, and considering connectivity within and between those watersheds. So I'll pause right there and see if anyone has questions or anything that we want to discuss further here. And it may come a little clearer when we start to look at some examples too.
I'll just say you've done a nice job capturing our concerns on this list. So I appreciate that.
Great. Glad to hear that.
Any other reactions to the list? And Shannon, this will probably become evident as you walk through the examples, but is the assumption, just to be explicit about this, is it fair to assume that the team worked to try to find a balance to the extent possible among each of these criteria, among all of the criteria, right? They were sort of weighted equally, and the effort was to try to maximize the potential benefit to each of the criteria where possible.
Exactly. And there were definitely situations where it was a trade-off between one criteria and the other, or, there might have been some constraints from one criteria that would limit how much you could do on another one. So those were all trade-offs that were part of the discussion, but we went through this list on each of the changes and discussed what those trade-offs and constraints were and where we could find a balance.
Great, that's helpful. And I think it's important for everybody to recognize it probably wasn't possible in every situation to, meet every single criteria, but that an effort was made to meet it as much as possible, or meet all of them as much as possible. So thanks for clarifying. Ken?
Yeah, Shannon, a specific question on roads and the operational feasibility piece there at the top. I like your list. It's a good one. I was just curious as to whether there yet has been any consideration given toward whether we close, leave open some of the roads, after operations, specifically short spurs in for logging operation or whatever it is we're doing. Is there consideration yet given to the time that we maintain specific roads on the system, and the time that they're left open for access? And I'm thinking specifically in terms of disturbance to wildlife and recreation access, and what that mix may or may not be.
Yeah, that's a great question. I know, so we're also working on developing the road strategy in alignment with the HCP. And I know in the updated draft of the HCP, there are more details that we're building on about the overall road network, decommissioning of roads, and definitions of temporary roads, which I believe would be less than 5 years. And so that's something that we're working on detailing out, those considerations for what would be a temporary road versus a permanent road, and sort of how we prioritize areas where we might be able to decommission roads would involve a balance of looking at what the management needs are of the forest, as well as the research needs, because there will be research access needed across the forest as well. And you could have an old spur road that researchers could walk down. You could have some areas where it might be more important to be able to drive a vehicle to get access. And then, as you mentioned, the ability of the public to access the forest. There's fire management aspect to it too. So making sure that there's the ability to access in an emergency different areas. And then I think one of the, you mentioned wildlife. One of the things that I think would definitely be picked up in the biodiversity plots and possibly part of the research was something we've noticed in walking around there. And anyone who interacts with wildlife probably knows well too that wildlife really like to use these spur roads and other roads as well. And as we were navigating across the forest, we were looking for the wildlife trails to try to find the easiest way to move sometimes across the landscape. So those are the details that we're all working on right now under the HCP, but there is that provision of what would be a temporary road versus a permanent part of the network.
And Shannon, you're going to have a real challenge there in terms of road management over time, and landscapes in the Coast Range are always heavily eroded, and it's heavily eroded because of past harvest practices, et cetera. But the mix that you're involving everyone in here in terms of these roads and what's a temporary, can we decommission, how do these roads affect wildlife? And of course, I'm speaking in terms of of the larger wildlife, elk in particular. And you're right about the trails. Elk trails are excellent ways to get around. Deer trails are too, unless said critters were moving at a high rate of speed, they tend to go straight up the hill instead of taking a reasonable approach. But I just wanted to mention, I do have a considerable amount of experience in road management planning, and I would love to engage any way I can, directly or indirectly, with the OSU folks in terms of having those discussions about what looks like a temporary road, what we can decommission, what we can use, and very particularly, the issue of fire. We at Forest Service level have discovered over time that the majority of the fires in the Coast Range are directly related to the road system and users on the road systems, rather than lightning strikes or some of the other fire start. So if I can be of help, I would love to engage, and I can do that either directly or indirectly through written communication. So thank you, Shannon.
That would be wonderful. That's definitely something that that we would love engagement from this group on. So we'll be working on sharing information on that, and Ken, I'll reach out to you specifically, but then we'll also share that with the full group for input.
Thanks, Ken. Any other comments on the criteria before we move to some examples? And I just want to be really explicit, and if you have comments, questions, concerns, it's an important time for you to voice them, so that it just as a reminder that the intent or the hope is that following this meeting, and we'll also do the outreach to a few folks that are part of this group, but are not able to be here today, to get any input they have. But the intent and the hope is that the OSU team moves forward with the rest of the sub-watersheds following this meeting, and any input, integrating any input you have. So don't hold back today, and try to, today's the day. I guess maybe not the only day, but it's an important day to get your feedback. So Bob, you're on mute.
Sorry, given that, I'll just echo Ken that I think roads are the one thing that is missing on there, and I should have caught that as well. Roads are going to be real important to the environmental community. And I would say that last one, the fragmentation and connectivity, is a big deal. We've talked about it a lot, but we haven't really, everything's been based on age to date, as you noted. So it's kind of, how do we also try and make sure those habitats become more robust that are left intact. So I would just highlight those two things, and channeling Noah and Bob Van Dyke. I'm glad to see steep slopes on there. Those upper reaches, those seasonal streams and things like that tend to get lost in all of our forest management at the state level. And those are important for so many species. So trying to figure out steep slopes, upper reaches, and things like that are important in this context.
Okay.
Oh, Bob, you got another one?
Nope.
Okay. Shannon,
Okay.
carry on.
Okay, so just one more text heavy slide, and then we can get into the into some example sub-watersheds. So when applying this criteria, there were some rules that we were following. And a main one was continuing to honor the stand age parameters that are set by the research proposal and this group. And so because of that, when we were looking at the criteria and any adjustments that we could make to stands or swaps between treatments, we were looking at a swap could be made between intensive, extensive, or reserve if it met these criteria that we just looked at, and the stand was less than 65 years old. So intensive is still in less than 65 years old, but swaps could be made between those if the stand was of that younger age. Acres with designated spotted owl or marbled murrelet habitat could not be moved into an intensive category. And marbled murrelet acres could only be moved from a reserve to an extensive if there was an equal acreage swap from extensive to reserve. So no net change in what treatment the marbled murrelet was designated in for that sub-watershed. The second bullet point here is a swap between extensive and reserve could be made if the stand was greater than 65 years old and it reduced fragmentation in addition to those other criteria that we were looking at. And then in order to maintain the research design, the overall percentage treatment allocation for the sub-watershed needed to remain in the approximate acres that the triad calls for. So reserve with intensive is 50% reserve, 50% intensive. Triad E, you see here 20, 40, 40, and then triad E 60%, 20%, and 20%. So as we were looking at these criteria, we were also looking at the total number of acres and looking at what all of these restrictions placed on us as far as our ability to make adjustments. And then finally here, the changes based on very steep slopes. So that's using that screen of 80% slope to pick out those steeper slopes could only be moved to a treatment category with greater retention. So for example, an area that was intensive on a steep slope could be changed to extensive or reserve, and extensive could be changed to a reserve, but it couldn't go the other way. So you couldn't have an extensive or reserve steep slope that would become intensive. So the overall goal of that last one was to decrease the amount of intensive and just look very closely at what treatments were happening on the steepest slopes where possible. So this chart shows the average slope in intensive stands only across these sub-watersheds that we were looking at. And you can see the average percent slope before and the average percent slope after. In a lot of cases, it was, relatively minor, a couple of percentage points or no change at all. There are a couple of areas where there was a little bit more change. Watersheds 4 and 95 in particular. So watershed 4 went from an average slope and intensive of 81 to 76. And watershed 95 went from an average slope of 60% to 51%. And you'll notice that the afters, none of them are higher than their befores. So it either stayed the same or went down slightly. So that was a good check on our approach, doing this analysis after all of the adjustments were made. And with that, I'll go ahead and stop sharing those slides. And we had a couple of examples that we wanted to start walking through. I think Deanne is here, so she has GIS that she can pull up if we want to look any closer at some of these specific sub-watersheds. And then I've also got the PowerPoint. So maybe we can start there. And if there's anything that we want to look at a little more closely, we can switch over to GIS. And Deanne and Katie, if there's anything that you want to add as we're talking about these, please do. Okay, so the first one that we wanted to start looking at is Sub-Watershed 4. This is a reserve with intensive stand, and at the July FMP working group meeting, we showed this as just a quick example of what we were working on. So we thought that this would be a good place to start. So in looking at the criteria, there are a couple edges of northern spotted owl core areas. There's a little bit of marbled murrelet up here in the northern part of the stand and throughout the reserves here. So you'll notice the gray hash marks are marbled murrelet. These circles are northern spotted owl. The red dots are trees greater than 150 feet in height. So this was using that 2021 LiDAR data. The riparian buffer system, the RCAs, are in gray. And looking at colors, the green is intensive and the blue is reserve, and darker means younger. So this area right here that's dark green is a younger intensive stand versus this lighter green here. The other thing to point out is this sub-watershed right here. This is Luder Creek, which is part of the CRW. So this is where one area where the CRW and MRW come together. So in looking at changes here in our list of criteria, I'll pull up this slide so we can see the stands highlighted. So the stands highlighted in teal are the ones where we made changes. The stand numbers have been added here, and we can share an updated version with you that has these stand numbers on it. But basically, when we were looking at trade-offs here, the marbled murrelet and the tallest trees align with the reserve system. So anywhere where we see that, that's not an area where we would make a swap with intensive. One of the major areas that we focused on is this area right here, which is a really steep slope in a head wall. And it had been in intensive with reserves down here in a less steep area. And so this was one of the main adjustments that we made, was taking these areas that had been in reserve and putting them in intensive, and then using that acreage to swap it here with the steeper head wall area and put this in reserve. The other thing that this does is creates connectivity between the CRW through this reserve system and into the next sub-watershed. And it also decreases fragmentation, because now you have bigger areas of reserve and you don't have as much smaller stands that are breaking up that reserve and intensive network. Deanne or Katie, do you have anything else that you wanted to add to that?
Well, I don't have anything specifically. I'm sure something will come up. And again, I've got a GIS here if we want to look at something more specifically. I guess I would point out for people that have been out there, this was one of that 2553, just about where that arrow is one of the stops. So you may be familiar with looking out across that very steep slope, across that draw up on the opposite slope.
Thanks, Dan. Katie, and any input from you, and then Bob, I see you have a comment or question. So Katie?
Yeah, the only other input too is one thing about the stand 2533 that you'll also notice, it's a very young stand. I think it's around 10 years old. And so it hasn't closed canopy yet. And it also is, so it's maintaining a much higher diversity of vegetation in it and such as that. So by bringing this into the reserve network, it's at an age where it's relatively easy to take that stand off of the trajectory of being dug for a plantation by doing some creative pre-commercial thinning in there. And it would be much less impact on the head wall system to do a pre-commercial thin than it would be to later on come in there and do a commercial thin or something else. And it's really on a trajectory right now to be a relatively dense Douglas fir plantation. The regeneration was quite successful. So it also points out, whereas the stands we swapped with which are older stands and are really not going to be easily more easily put on a pathway of increased diversity, because they've lost all their understory at this point because of the heavy shading by the dug fir plantation canopy. And so we figured that would be better just to keep them in intensive and then put something that has more potential in the future for increased diversity into reserves.
Thanks, Katie. This is a really helpful narrative and description of sort of your team's thinking around this. So I appreciate that. Bob?
Yeah, so I just want to make sure I'm understanding this right. So what are the age classes of 214 and 11122?
I can pull up that spreadsheet. Deanne, do you have those numbers?
I think they're
It's
40
a
years
little hard
old.
for me to get to them, but I mean, I would put, just looking at the veg heights there, 11122 is probably 50 years old in that age class. I just looked at 2533 this morning. That's 10 years old.
Mhm.
And maybe to the assumption, though, is that anything that's in intensive is less than 60 years old. Is that correct?
Less than 65 as of 2020.
That's
Yes.
right.
Okay, so basically, we're not losing any older stands in this swap then.
No,
Okay, all right.
if you're not seeing bright red, they're probably not older stands.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
Or any scattered older trees too. We also looked at that.
Ken, do you have a question or comment?
Yeah, real quick question. This 2533, the 10-year-old stand there, is it fair to assume that 10-year-old stands are probably don't have a lot of stands across the forest that are younger than 10? In other words, in the harvest history on the forest, I think this is probably representative of the youngest stands we have.
That's correct. I think the youngest stand that I've seen in the inventory is 7. There were a couple harvested, in the 2015 or something like that. This is certainly one of the youngest stands. Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. Bob?
Yep, I'm down.
Okay, good. All right, you want to carry on, Shannon?
Sure. Let me go ahead and flip forward. If there are any in particular that this group wants to talk about too,
Can you go over the steep slopes on that one?
Oh, yeah.
You went through that image pretty quickly, but I think it's an important one.
No, that's a great point, Katie. Okay, so here's that image again. Here's the steep slopes. So this is that 80% slope. All of these areas that are in orange, this is a really steep sub-watershed overall. You can see here, this is that young intensive stand that we were talking about that's about 10 years old. And it is relatively steep compared to these areas down here that had been in reserve. This one still has steep slopes. This one does not have nearly as many of that 80% or higher steep slope. So that was one of the areas that we were looking at. And then the other, just talking about defragmentation, there are a couple tiny little areas you'll see highlighted here too that we didn't talk about that were fragments of intensive. And so those were switched to reserve.
Why was 11122 and 214 in reserve to begin with? Was it just simply because they were older? They were the oldest under 65 and you had to get to a certain number? I mean,
Exactly. Yeah,
okay.
that first decision-making point was based purely on age. And because this is a 50% reserve and intensive, these were under 65, but towards the older end, whereas this one down here was one of the younger ones. And so that's why that originally looked like that. And so when we apply these additional criteria on top of that, we're able to move that around a little bit.
Okay.
And while maintaining the integrity of the design, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, got it.
So there's the changes side by side. Let's see. So next we wanted to look at watershed 95, which is Cougar Creek. And again, if there are details that this group wants to look at more, we can ask Deanne to pull them up in GIS and get a clearer view at some of these details at a different spatial scale. But this is,
Shannon, there's one other thing in here that I don't think we covered, and I'm sorry if I missed it. The darker the color, so if it's in that extensive orangey brown color, the darker the color is, let me get this right, the younger the trees are. And the lighter the color is, the older they are. And so when you look at an area like this, the first thing that kind of jumps out is that the oldest trees are also the tallest. And so when you see those bright red stripes, you're seeing bands of old trees, often in riparian conservation areas. Or if you see a big block of them, it's probably a stand that's well over 65. And so if you're not seeing any red, but you're seeing dark brown versus light brown, that's young under 65 and older under 65. So kind of it once you learn that, you can kind of read the landscape as you first see it kind of come up. And so you get a picture of what this sub-watershed looks like in terms of the balance between over 65 and under 65. And then within the under 65, what the balance is between the age classes. So
That's super helpful.
Yeah.
My brain wants to go to the darker being older automatically.
me too. I have that same bias.
yeah, no, that's really helpful, particularly looking at this, because now we've got a mixture of reserve, intensive, and extensive. So you'll see the intensive, this green is all dark compared to, for example, this intensive over here that's lighter. So these are relatively young intensive stands. The brown, or it looks that way because of the image underneath. So this is extensive. As Katie was saying, this darker brown here is younger, whereas this would be an older extensive.
But
So,
still under 65. So that's.
yeah, so looking at this sub-watershed, we've got it outlined here in black. Let me go ahead and go to this change view. So you'll see there's a couple different things that we're working with here. We have these spotted owl core area right here that we need to make sure we're paying attention to, as well as the hash marks for the marbled murrelet. Once again, the dark red are these bands of older trees. And you can see, by and large, a lot of them follow the reserve and the riparian systems. There are some scattered trees. This is a younger intensive area that has some scattered taller trees in it. And so what we were looking at when making a swap here, one of the things that we did is in the southeast corner, this had been intensive. This is a younger stand because it's darker. We switched that into extensive. This decreases fragmentation. It creates more connectivity here between other areas of extensive and then reserve. And then we also made a swap here to decrease fragmentation, as well as up here. So now you have more of a reserve to extensive instead of a reserve right next to intensive up here. And then there's also decreased fragmentation here, where now there's areas of intensive that are younger intensive, but then some older intensive too, still less than 65. There was also, just looking at my notes, there's a little fragment down here. This had been intensive in the spotted owl circle, and so that was changed to reserve. And one of the reasons why that may have been an intensive fragment is this is a sub-watershed boundary. You'll see this is the next sub-watershed here. And so that could have been just an alignment issue with topography and then the sub-watershed and stand boundaries.
So Shannon, sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna ask, Shannon, are you ready for comments or questions?
Yeah, I guess just one more thing to point out, and this is very similar to the conversation that Katie was having on the last one, but looking at silvicultural suitability, changing this area to extensive when it's younger, allows for more flexibility in the types of management that could be used here to put this on a different trajectory, as opposed to these older intensive stands that are still less than 65, but what we've been seeing across the forest, as Katie said, is that the regeneration has been really successful. And so many of these, unless they've had an intermediate treatment, are fairly dense Douglas fir stands. And so there's also an operations and just silvicultural approach piece to this too.
Thanks. Before we go to comments and questions from the committee, Katie or Deanna, anything you would want to add?
Shannon, can you put on the side by side? Just as I'm a side by side fan, particularly when you're talking about reduced fragmentation. And that's part of what you can start to see in here, was that grouping of the intensive and the extensive has reduced the fragmentation of treatments within this sub-watershed.
Something too that I think is worth pointing out is in the southeast corner, if you look at the before slide, there's that young, you're on it right there, there's that young intensive that's in marbled murrelet, and that's a classification issue. We've had to deal with the marbled murrelet, that it comes up quite frequently, that it was probably surveyed prior to harvest, and of course it's probably no longer suitable marbled murrelet habitat, but it remains in the database and in the program, HCP program, is being marbled murrelet. So those are some areas that we kind of have to balance and think about as we're shifting things around.
Thanks. Colin and then Bob. Sorry, Colin, you're on mute.
I hit one of the buttons. I needed to hit the other one too. I just wanted to say that generally these changes make a lot of sense to me. I do have one concern, which is it sounds like there's a lot of the older plantations that no longer have an understory are being moved from extensive to intensive, because that, it's not an ideal condition to have an older plantation that you're managing holistically that no longer has an understory. But my concern is that we don't always, in forest management, we don't always have ideal conditions. And I would like to see some of those older plantations that aren't ideal for that type of ecological forestry still available to test how best to manage them under that extensive model.
Is it possible, Shannon, are there, in spite of the efforts to sort of apply the criteria and reduce those, are there still examples that persist on the forest that might address or allow for some of the questions Colin's interested in to still be explored?
Yeah, no, that's a really important point, Colin. I was just making a note of that, and I think the answer is yes, that there will be those areas, particularly in sub-watersheds where there's just a lot more constraints with habitat or other criteria where we wouldn't be able to make those changes. But that's something that we can take a look at just to see sort of how much of that persists on the landscape, these older plantations that are still inextensive. Overall, I think this is one of the watersheds that had one of the acreage wise more swaps than some of the others. there's one sub-watershed I'm thinking of in particular, I think it was 68, where really we didn't find many swaps or changes that we could make other than reducing some fragments along the borders of the sub-watershed. But that's definitely something we can take a look at and make sure that we do have those older plantations, some of them still inextensive. And I think we will, just based on the percentages that are required from the triad, and then how the constraints that some of these other criteria place on what we could do.
Okay, thanks.
So you can see some of those on this, the lighter colored brown are all older plantations that are inextensive in this picture.
Right here.
And down, yeah, there's a lot of them.
Okay, yeah, I suspected that there would still be some left over that couldn't be swapped. I just wanted to make sure we had some of those represented.
Yeah, and I think they're going to be challenging, to be honest, to put them into extensive and try to improve the biodiversity given the state they're in now. And so we did have some good surprises though. It was Upper Elk Creek, I think, where we went into some of the stands and they had been thinned previously. You know, they were young stands, they'd been planted and they'd been thinned, and they had so much more diversity in them than we would have expected because of the thinnings had kept it. So that was kind of, I just wrote a message this morning saying, you know, the next kind of screen that we need to put on these to the degree we can is what's been harvested prior, and therefore would be most likely to have retained a higher component of the understory and in place relative to the ones the lights have been out for 40 years, and so there isn't really any understory left. And so that was really interesting as we went through some of these stands and looked at them on the ground, was the potential that some of them have been entered even as a commercial thinning, and left some really interesting structural diversity in those stands. So we saw two good examples of that.
Great, thanks, Katie. Colin, thanks for the question. Bob, and then Ken.
I'm curious, down in the lower right-hand spotted owl circle, you have intensive in there, a good deal of intensive. In fact, your arrow is a little, yeah, right there. It's also core marble murrelet habitat as well there. And I'm just curious about that, because you got both a circle and murrelet habitat kind of overlapping, and a good deal of intensive sitting there.
Yeah, that's in a different sub-watershed, so we'd have to pull that one up and look at the details. But the mixture of reserve, extensive, and intensive within this owl circle would have been from that initial allocation. So based on under the confines of the HCP, it's darker, so this is going to be a younger intensive stand. And you can see the tall trees are along the riparian area and in this extensive. So this looks like probably one of those misclassifications that Dan was talking about, where this is marbled murrelet habitat based on the surveys and the modeling that we have. But because this is so young, likely what happened is between the time of when that data was collected and now, there was a harvest there. So this is a mismatch in data, most likely, that we're trying to work through.
Okay, so if you had discovered that it was accurate, though, it's occupied marble murrelet habitat, it was older trees, would that have gotten addressed, or would that not have gotten addressed?
That should have been addressed with the 2015 ODF inventory. If it was, that would have been the cutoff for less than 65 or older than 65. But I think that's where it would have first been addressed. But then if we went out there and saw that this data was inaccurate, then that would be an area to go back and make an adjustment, I think.
This was brought up in the research proposal stage that there was mismatches, and we did presentations on it, and talked about it. And the decision at the time for the proposal stage was to develop a process, and the first screening of the process was to look at these stands and with the LiDAR and see if there were any remnant habitat in them. And if not, they should be moved out of marbled murrelet habitat. If there was any remnant habitat in them, even, you know, so many trees per acre that were, you know, residuals from prior, the recommendation was they be visited by wildlife biologists to get a expert opinion on whether or not they're continually marbled murrelet habitat. And the third was to, if they did have those components, to keep them in marbled murrelet habitat. But the reality is there was, I forget how many acres, Deanne, if you recall, I think there was about 1,400 acres total of intensive that got classified as marbled murrelet habitat because there was no screening done based on the age that the occupation was recorded compared to the age of the stand today. And so that is something that still needs to be done to have an accurate sense of where the marbled murrelet habitat is.
Yeah.
And so that process is written up in the research proposal, and I believe it's even written up in the HCP, as I recall, on how to handle these stands. But that said, since this is also in an owl circle, when we look at this sub-watershed, which I don't even know if it's a partial or if it's a whole sub-watershed yet, I'm thinking, but when we look at it, like we're looking through this lens now, that could be something we would look perhaps to swap because of the spotted owl circle, if there's a swappable piece somewhere else. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
So you could see, just looking above, we can kind of do a pretend swap now. When I look at this picture and I look to the north, I see some extensive that's embedded into some intensive, you know, and so that would be a place here where maybe we could take that extensive that's up above, kind of embedded in this intensive, and make that extensive instead of intensive. So within that circle.
Thanks, Katie. And we come to Ken's question, and then Shannon, before Ken, you take yourself off mute, while you're taking yourself off mute, Shannon, how many more sub-watersheds would you like to go through? We have about 15 minutes-ish for this topic, and I'm fine bleeding over, but want to save just a little bit of time to brief on the monitoring.
Yeah, I wanted to do a time check with you. We've got one or two more that we had picked out as examples, just depending on time. So
great.
We could do one or we could do both.
Well,
just depending on what the group wants to discuss.
We'll take the questions as they come, and I suspect overall the questions are helping people understand the methodology as much as the nuance of any particular sub-watershed. So the questions are helpful, not just for this particular, but also more generally in understanding the concept and how it was applied. So keep the questions coming. We'll try to get them addressed and maybe take at least one more. And if time allows, we'll take that second one. So Ken, go ahead.
Thanks, Katie, for some of what you said. My question kind of went to, well, it's twofold, but first generally was about the complexity or lack of complexity in these kind of older plantations that are being looked at as extensive. There's been quite a bit of commercial thinning and various sorts of prescriptive approaches on the Siuslaw that had to do with gap creation and underplanting and a number of other methods that were used in some of these older plantations as they were thin, but recognizing on that federal land that once we get to 80, we do nothing from there on out. So there were some pretty heavy thinnings in various places. So there's probably some information that we could glean from that. But my specific question had to do with the prescriptive pieces of these stands in the, I believe, not too distant future, but the question straight up is, when can we expect to actually see some of the prescriptions for amount of removal, gap creation, and distribution of the treatments over time, across these watersheds?
Katie, did you want to take that question?
Go ahead. You can, unless you want me to, but
Okay.
I was just going to highlight the spreadsheet we were talking about yesterday. So,
Yeah, well, if you want to do that, that sounds great.
well, we were talking about this exact question, and we've been working with the different groups, whether they be people working on extensive or the CRW thinning treatments, et cetera, and kind of developing what we call a decision matrix that'll be in place both to help guide the inventory output. So it's essentially looking at the stand, the conditions of the physical setting. So whether it's in marble murrelet habitat, what the steep slope, how steep the slope is, et cetera. And then it'll go through some criteria of what the existing stand looks like from the inventory. And those could be everything from crown depth of the 100, I don't know, the 100 deepest crowns, and other metrics that we'll use to help us describe, quantify the stand conditions. And then we'll have a series of potential trajectories for that stand, depending on the landscape targets for early seral, mid seral, or late seral, or whatever the targets are at the landscape level. And then we'll start to see how well we can match current stand conditions, kind of this tailoring to the landscape component, and then how many of them need to have a trajectory change, and then what that trajectory change will look like. So that's all in play. It's waiting right now for the inventory data. So we have current stand conditions well described, and a lot of the groundwork that has been laid by the committees this summer is really to start to develop those targets. So it's underway, and that will come about as soon as we get the inventory in place to figure out what those stand treatments would be to meet the targets that we have. Does that make sense?
Thank you, Katie. No, that answers my question. Thanks.
Yeah.
So-
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Okay.
I was just going to say, so, what Katie was describing, this is where all of these pieces come together, where there's the work that the groups have been doing on outlining what the goals and objectives are of extensive and some of these restoration treatments, intensive, overlaid with this decision matrix, and then that updated data coming in from the forest inventory based on the 2021 LiDAR data. And then there's the ability to use the landscape models that work has been done to parameterize and calibrate to run scenarios on what this looks like. So we get a snapshot at a stand level to sub-watershed to landscape level. And these treatments adjustments are critical to that too, like we've been saying. So making sure that we have an understanding of what this treatment is for this stand, and with this proposed change, moving it from an extensive to an intensive, for all the reasons we've been talking about, that would be a critical piece of information that would feed into this decision tree.
Thanks, Shannon and Katie. And are you in a position where you have a sense of like timeline for when you'd have that capability, or?
The latest update that we got from the team that's working on the forest inventory is early September.
Okay.
And we're working with someone here at the college who's going to be in charge of that database.
Thanks. Helpful. All right. I think we may be ready for the next one.
one more question. I forget, was that the watershed Cougar Creek where the trail is that we were trying to locate?
Yes, you're right, Katie.
So Bob, do you know where the trail is in Cougar Creek, or do you have a map? Because we'd like to make sure it's included in our database, and we can't find the location of the trail.
Francis would have that, and Francis is actually on the call right now too, or on the Zoom. So I'll get that from Francis, or
Okay.
Francis, if you want to send it along, that'd be great.
Thank you. That would be really helpful. Let's see. Okay. So we wanted to also look at Sub-Watershed 113. So I'll go ahead and pull up the big view with the changes highlighted, and then we can look at the side-by-side view as Katie was talking about. So you can see this is an area with quite a bit of marbled murrelet habitat. The outline again here is in black. There is a spotted owl circle here. You can see some of the issues that we were talking about before, where there's marbled murrelet habitat in areas that are classified as intensive, that are less than 65 years old. You can see some tall trees again here in the riparian area, but other than the tip of this riparian area, not seeing tall trees here. And again, this is darker. So this is a younger intensive. This would be an older intensive, but still less than 65. So this is another area where we're looking at some of those classification issues. You can also see just sort of the constraints on what you might be able to do in this situation. So the reserve really closely follows tall trees, marbled murrelet habitat. There's an area up here, an extensive that is in marbled murrelet habitat. So this would be an area of 80% retention. You can see some fragments that were cleaned up. Let me pull up the side by side. Here's the slopes. So you can see the slopes here as well. Steeper here in this part of the sub-watershed and in some of the areas over here. This is also, you can see the Millicoma running through sub-watershed 113 as well. And so if we're looking at this side by side, what we can see here are some areas along the Millicoma that had been in extensive. So you can look at them before here. There are these little slivers of extensive that have been changed to reserve to increase protections along the Millicoma and decrease fragmentation. There's this area here that is a younger intensive classified as marbled murrelet, but also creates some fragmentation here where this is now turned into an extensive stand. And then you've got some fragmentation down here in the corner. It looks like these were maybe both extensive, and it's hard to see under these red dots right now, but this piece was changed to a reserve and this piece to an intensive to get rid of that little fragment there. So the big adjustments here are reducing intensive in this northern spotted owl core area, taking an intensive and moving it to an extensive. Let's see, consolidating the reserve in these fragments along the Millicoma River, and then eliminating the stand slivers. And there is additional work to go back here through that process that Katie was discussing. And look at this area of probably misclassification where you have marbled murrelet on intensive and clearly in some young areas too.
There was one other pretty big change of an extensive just south of the circle that was converted to reserve.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one to point out. So this was a little island of extensive here that was put into reserve, and you can see lots of tall trees here.
Thanks, Shannon. before we get to Bob's question, Katie or Deanna, anything else you'd want to observe or add?
I wanted to point out we were talking about the reserves, the extensive that got placed into reserve, but there's also, to keep the acreages balanced out, there's also, you'll note, you can't see my arrow here, but where your arrow is there, there's that area there that went from reserve into extensive. So it goes back and forth. And I also just wanted to be clear, because I put this together and just for the vegetation heights and what we're looking at here, these light and dark colors, the background, we're looking at a background of that is actually the vegetation height layer from the LiDAR. So we're looking at actual vegetation heights. So in those areas that are in Marble Murrelet, those are areas that have been harvested likely since the survey was done, because it seems very unlikely that Marble Murrelet would be in those areas and in those, maybe those fragment trees that are up in the draws. But just to be clear, that's not inventory data, that's a picture, that's the LiDAR picture of the tree heights from the 2021 LiDAR.
Thanks, Deanne. Helpful clarification. Katie, did you have anything before I take Bob's question or comment?
Nope.
Great, thanks. Bob?
Yeah, I guess this watershed raises a lot of questions. Buck Creek was one of the ones we were concerned about. There's aloes in there, there's merlets, there's older trees, there's a lot of potential fragmentation occurring in there. So there's a worry on this one that we're perpetuating and perhaps even exacerbating what the state did historically. It also, I say, is troubling to keep hearing about these places that were surveyed that had merlets and the state went in and logged. The state went in and logged illegally if there were merlets in there. And so it just seems like there's an awful lot of designated merlet habitat where there were potentially surveys done, birds were identified, and then it was logged anyways. And I think that needs to inform a bit of the discussion, is realizing that a lot of these places we think merlets are at because they were found there, the state took them out, and that's had an impact on the available habitat that's in this forest. I guess looking at the two questions. One, looking at the spotted owl circle, it just looks like between the intensive and the extensive, a lot of that circle is getting hit one way or another. And do we actually meet the criteria of the HCP for protection, given how much intensive and extensive is in there? And then number two, the area that Deanne just pointed out, where it's going from reserve to intense or to extensive, that's tall trees and marble murrelet habitat. So that's a significant change there. You get trees over 150 feet, marble murrelet habitat, and contiguous with other marble murrelet habitat as well. So when I look at that, I see tall trees, marble murrelets, and increased fragmentation potentially.
Yeah, so that's a good spot to point out. So if we're looking at this piece right here,
Right.
and then this piece down here, approximately, just looking at it with an eye, they're approximately the same acreage. This one's a little bit bigger, both marbled murrelet, both lots of tall trees. And so in that case, I believe this swap was made with the intention of maintaining that marbled murrelet habitat. So it gets back to that criteria of you can't take marbled murrelet from a reserve to an extensive unless you're putting at least the same acreage of extensive into reserve. And then looking at decreasing that fragmentation. So right now, or before, this was extensive, and it was a piece that was kind of in between intensive and reserve, whereas now this is reserve. This was a piece of reserve abutting extensive, and now it's a slightly larger area of extensive. So it is a trade-off.
What happens if you aren't able to implement Matt Betts's marble murrelet. You know, we're dealing with issues over on that side as well in terms of the viability of that experiment. If you're not able to take occupied marble murrelet habitat, you really can't take either, or until you figure out how to do that within the confines of the HCP, right?
The HCP says that, yes, there's that 500-acre marbled murrelet research experiment with the 80% retention. And then pending those results, there would be the option to move to other areas of extensive, but not before there were results from that experiment that align with the HCP. Yeah, this could be, you know, an area like this that's all being developed under that that experiment is, you know, identifying those areas that would be part of that 500 acres. But if this wasn't part of that experiment, then it wouldn't be harvested until there were that experiment had run and there were results.
How many acres are we talking about there? Can you tell me what the acreage is on that little piece?
That's a good question. I can't pull up the spreadsheet right now because my screen is taken up. Deanne or Katie, do you have that?
It's not acreage, Bob, but the scale below is, you know, the black bar there is 2 kilometers. So it's, you know, less than a kilometer, less than, you know, by less than a, you know, half a kilometer, a quarter kilometer.
The circle's 500 acres, I believe, right? So that gives you some idea. I'd say it's around 40 or 50 acres.
And just
But-
go back to my circle question. So you are meeting under this proposal, under the revised, you are meeting the criteria of the HCP on that circle?
We looked at all of these when we were screening them, and I don't recall any that were not making it. Dan, do you remember? She's probably looking for the acres.
I was looking for the acres. We haven't specifically looked at the acres. That was an element of the HCP analysis. In doing those changes, I think generally looking at it, you can see that we made a positive change. The direction of change was to increase habitat, or at least decrease intensive within this spotted owl circle. But I haven't specifically done a spatial analysis of the acreages. Within that owl circle, I believe the HCP is what, 50% needs to be nesting, roosting, forage, which I assume would be in reserve. But really, that would require a more specific analysis of the before and after. All I can say is that I think generally the vector in making these adjustments was to increase nesting, roosting, forage within the owl circles.
Yeah, I
But
just want to make sure we're not.
we did look them all up in the HCP. You called them up there's numbers on each one of these circles. And we did look at them specifically to see if they were meeting the criteria. And as I recall, we didn't find any that were not meeting the criteria. That's what I was trying to remember. When we were going through, you remember that, Shannon? Is that your memory too?
Yeah, that is.
And so that's just that piece. And the other thing I wanted to address before we go on is where there's overlap in the hash marks and young stands doesn't necessarily mean that ODF went into these because on purpose or whatever. It's because every one of these is a combination of 3 databases. There's the ODF database of occupied. There's we call it the Kim Nelson database of occupied. And there's the predicted occupied or predicted potential occupation or marble murrelet habitat from Matt's model. Okay, so some of these are predicted occupied habitat from Matt's model, but the age of the database used to make those predictions was old, of the spatial database. And so some of the mistakes are just based on that era and aren't necessarily ODF out to destroy habitat. So I just want to make sure that was clear, that we don't know the source of what, when it's hashed, it's from all three of those sources. And so we just have to be careful about that it's just possible that Matt's database used like a 2012, I think, modus for the classification. And so that just could be the error in some, particularly the dark colored ones. The light colored one is more of a mystery to me. But
Okay, that helps.
So
I have to make sure we didn't do a flyby here though, Katie, because the original HCP, the first draft had like 50% of the owl nest being taken, and then we revised it on paper for sure to say that it wouldn't. The revised HCP commits OSU commits to protecting them all, and then the standards for that were set at that time, so that 50% that you're talking about came in there. And I just want to make sure that we actually did go back and actually look at those circles then and applied it on the ground, so that we're not looking at the original sort of data and the new criteria side by side. We're looking at new analysis and that has been demonstrated to meet those criteria, if I'm making sense there.
let me verify with Shannon that it made sense, and then have the OSU team ground truth it, not ask them to respond right now, but run it to ground and make sure that we are trued up in terms of how the analysis was conducted. Shannon or Katie, but.
Yes, that made sense.
Okay. Thanks. And I'm just aware of the time, and I want to make sure that we have enough time to both validate sort of folks' willingness to allow. I know that there will still be heartburn for some of you on, things you wish might look different. There was compromises in getting to resolution on the platform, and everybody made some compromises to get to yes, to move forward with that. And there may be still places that there are heartburn, places that, if Paul were here, look particularly good for harvest opportunities that are going to be underutilized potentially from his perspective, and likewise may have habitat that folks would wish were used a different way or protected in a different way. That being said, I want to see if does anybody have concerns with any of the advisory committee members have concerns with the OSU team moving forward, applying the criteria on the additional sub-watersheds as the criteria have been described today. Colin?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if it would be possible to get a change log going stand by stand describing the rationale for, what swaps were made and the rationale for each swap.
How big of a, go ahead, Shannon.
Yeah, we do have, so you'll see the stand numbers are on here. And so we went through that process, and then there's also a spreadsheet version showing each of the stands and what they were before and what they were after. So Deanne and Katie, is that something that we have accessible, or do you think that would get at Colin's question?
I'm not sure. If I can rephrase your question, I guess, Colin, if we swap, I don't know, make up number, stand number 42 for number 100, right? You would want a log to say we made that swap to decrease fragmentation, or we made that swap to decrease steep slope impacts, or we made that swap to align silvicultural options better. Is that what you're looking for?
Yeah, exactly. I'm wondering if that's something that you've been documenting as you've been going through this process, and if you can share that.
Yeah, we kind of document, we do it at a larger scale in the beginning, where we kind of say, here's the percentage of acres within a sub-watershed that were swapped. Then we have the change in slope percentages within the sub-watershed that are in intensive. So it's just the intensive one that's highlighted there. We also list kind of at the beginning of each one, kind of the changes made and what they resulted in overall. We don't say this specific swap was made to do this, but instead we say we've decreased fragmentation, we've reduced the number of intensive acres on steep head walls, we've decreased the amount of intensive within owl circle. Those are kind of listed at the beginning of each. I don't know if you've looked at the thing, but we don't have it by stand, but we do have that list at the, I don't know, the title slide for the sub-watershed.
Okay.
Is that, so, because sometimes there's multiple reasons for making a swap, but we could do that. It'll just really slow the process down, but.
Okay, well, yeah, I'll take a look and let you know if I have any specific questions.
Want to show one of those slides, Shannon? We didn't spend much time on them in the interest of time, because it was just. Yeah. So it's this list of actions.
Okay. And then as a follow-up question, you had a spreadsheet comparing, I think it was average percent slope by watershed. Have you looked at any of the other metrics like average age, standing inventory, anything like that before and after?
I have personally, but they weren't in this summary.
Okay, yeah, I'm just curious if that's something you could share. I just would like.
Yeah,
to see
that would be
some information.
relatively easy to do. Average age would be relatively easy.
And
And that would be in the under 65 category only.
Mhm.
thanks, Colin, for the questions, and yeah, desire for additional information. And it's in, but you are okay with the team moving forward with applying the criteria for the rest of the MRW sub-watershed?
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense to me, the methodology and the reasoning. So yeah, I'm comfortable with it. I just wanted to take a little bit closer look to see if there's anything that stood out.
Great. No, that's terrific. Appreciate your willingness to do that, Bob. And then I'm gonna try to move us to the monitoring piece real quick.
Yeah, just to answer your question, Peter. Yeah, I mean, I need to go through it still as well. I know we had a meeting canceled yesterday, so I assume we're going to have a subgroup meeting rescheduled in the near future. I can probably get my questions together by then. Probably what we'll want to do is, this, as I said, this is one of those rank 4 level concern watersheds. So probably want to dig down deeper on those first individually, and then maybe with Katie and Shannon and Deanne, just to kind of really get a clear understanding. I think one of the things I'm struggling with, honestly, is trying to reconcile what I have in my head from going through that first set of maps, whatever it was 3 years ago, where we had a pretty good understanding of where we thought merlet habitat was and older forest, and trying to reconcile that with my head with what we have now and kind of how those things line up and how the numbers have really shifted. The biggest thing for us, though, is going to remain kind of fragmentation and understanding in some of those watersheds like Buck Creek, whether, I know you're working toward it, but whether we've really been able to bring that down, or if we're really setting ourselves up for a situation where, as I mentioned before, we kind of have these starfish in terms of merlet habitat, where because of past logging practices, they're really, really vulnerable. And are we actually exacerbating that to the point where we may continue to have loss rather than either stabilization or potentially gain?
Thanks, Bob. Appreciate it. And just so I say it again, we have a couple of other, obviously, all of this will go before the full advisory committee for them to have input on. All of you are some of the most engaged at this level of detail on these particular set of topics. And we'll also get in touch with Mark and Paul and anybody else who a part of the work group that may want to provide any additional input on the criteria in their application. But with that said, for purposes of today, we'll assume we've got the green light to move forward, applying the criteria on the rest of the sub-watersheds. Appreciate the conversation, the input, the questions, and the willingness to continue to dig into the details as we get to the next iterations. With that, and with an eye towards the clock, we'll take 5 or 10 minutes on the monitoring topic. We want to preserve 10 minutes for public comment. Barb, Sue, and Francis, I have each of you teed up and ready. And with that, Shannon, I'll let you briefly introduce the monitoring topic at the outset of the meeting. Yeah, let's take it from there.
Yeah, so I guess just to circle back to the beginning of the meeting, where I kind of laid out the major categories of what is covered under that monitoring framework. This is the first draft. So you'll notice, if you've had a chance to review it yet, that there are placeholders for additional measurements and pieces of the monitoring program that are under development with various members of the technical groups and other experts. So we'd welcome your feedback on what's been written already. We're working on digging into a deeper level of detail on some of those sections, as well as adding other sections. If you have questions about something that you think might be missing, or how these various parts of the monitoring plan layer on each other to kind of leverage the full extent of what's been planned as far as the surveys and plots and monitoring equipment out there, that would all be helpful feedback for us. And I'll just note that Dana Warren was also able to join us. He's on the call today. So if there's anything related to the aquatic and riparian systems that you have a question about, he can also try to address that too.
Thanks, Shannon, and thanks, Dana, for being here. Any comments or questions so far? Dana, anything you'd want to share with the group related to the riparian work and aquatic work?
I don't know if there's anything specific other than I want to reiterate that this is our first draft. We have an advisory committee for aquatic and riparian work that includes Tiffany Garcia, who's a herpetologist. It includes Kevin Bladen and Catalina Segura, who are hydrologists. So I and as well as a number of other people. I just know those are places where people have particular interests. So they have not yet provided, I mean, I've had conversations with them, but they now have not provided sort of specific edits on this. But I want to make sure people know that this is not just me spouting off. This is something we're trying to put together carefully and with input from a range of people. So I guess that's all. Like, and I this is a draft, and so this is really a good time to provide feedback. And I recognize we have a short-ish time frame here. So if people have comments or edits, I'm totally open to getting feedback from people on stuff. If there's something you really think is missing, I'm happy to either have a conversation or work on trying to address that. So if it doesn't come up today, this is not, I guess we're on some kind of timeline, but it's not your only chance to provide some input. So.
Great, thanks, Dana, and yeah, I think for everybody, encourage you to review, as I said at the beginning of the meeting, encourage you to review this chapter as with each of them. Provide your feedback directly to the OSU team, directly to Dana in this case, or through Shannon, Katie, and you can do it in track changes and make suggested edits or broad, narrative sort of suggestions and feedback. I think all of it is welcomed, and the team will do their best to integrate it, address your questions and concerns to the extent possible in the next iteration. That being said, you all have different perspectives on topics. So, it doesn't, providing the feedback doesn't mean you get to say exactly how things are, but you certainly get to provide input into the conversation. And if there's differing opinions, we'll work to pull you together and talk through those. So any additional thoughts, questions, comments on either the criteria, the allocations, or the monitoring work? All right, with that, I'm just going to briefly touch on next steps, and then we'll go to public comment and again wrap this up and be done no later than noon. We have an advisory committee meeting coming up on the 7th of September. Materials for that, in part, some of the feedback from today, and additional chapters, refinements from the previous chapters that this group has already reviewed, are all going to be compiled and will be distributed along with the agenda Friday. So you'll have it a week and a half before. Much of that will look familiar to this group in particular, because you've been engaged in this FMP work, which will be a great deal of the focus of that meeting. And then so if you have comments, questions in advance of that meeting, we look forward to engaging with you then. And as a reminder, if you haven't done so, let us know if you're going to be there in person or joining virtually. So it'll be available for in person for advisory committee members. We'll have a Zoom link for members of the public and anybody from the advisory committee who can't be there in person. And then much to come in the fall as we head into further into September, October, and ultimately towards a December land board meeting. With that, Barb, if you have a couple of minutes for public comment, and look forward to hearing from you. If you want to come off camera or on camera, you're welcome to do so. But either way, come off mute.
Hi, can you hear me?
We gotcha.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am. Barb.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Barb.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Barb, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry. Okay, so we're down here on the Millicoma. Just a quick thing regarding the survival and the return of the species, noting that last night my neighbor Melissa down here on the West Fork Millicoma called me to report a 5-legged salamander, I believe they found on their river walking, and I'm very curious. She was very curious as to who to give that information to. Perhaps somebody on your aquatic and amphibious team, it would be interested in to see a critter like that. And another thing is under OSU as compared to Oregon Department of Forestry, what is the difference and the proposed volume extraction target for logging? And is NOAA on board to preserve the old stands that we've talked about relevant to carbon sequestration? And will there be any legal constraints as to our continued mitigation to protect the old trees as far as the public is concerned? That's a lot of questions, I know.
Yeah, so thanks, and thanks for your willingness to note that there was a lot of questions there. I will make a couple of quick comments. One, first of all, with just a short amount of time, and I know that Francis and others have comments, questions. We probably won't have enough time to be able to answer all of your questions. I would, though, note that the research platform and proposal that went before the land board in 2019 will be a really helpful source of information in terms of looking at those volume numbers. And then the draft HCP, the Habitat Conservation Plan, would also be a really valuable in terms of understanding the federal agency's perspective and the regulatory sort of assurances around this work going forward. That is, I believe, out for public comment now. And you can find all of that on the project website, either at Department of State Lands or OSU. So thanks for joining us, Barb. And I think if you get that information about the amphibian to any of the OSU team members, they'd be happy to give it a gander. All right, Sue.
Okay. I'm trying to Okay, never mind. Okay, your host has stopped. All right. I was just wondering if beavers are allowed to be trapped at the Elliott. Is that something that happens? And then I have one more question.
Is there a yes, no answer for Sue?
I'll have, I'm not an expert on the Oregon rules, but I believe under the trapping rules are set by Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife,
Yes.
right? And so I don't know exactly if OSU or or DSL, who will be the owners of the land, can prohibit trapping if it's allowable under OD F&W regulations. That's one question I have, so I can't answer it from that standpoint. I do know that based, and I'll have Dana could chime in on this, based on our recent riparian tour that we did and the loss of bed load and the problem with that in terms of salmon spawning and everything else, I would think beavers would be very welcome on the Elliott from a recovery standpoint. But again, I think Dana could probably speak to that better than I can. And then the third point is, and this is from discussions, is the amount of beaver habitat on the Elliott also can be limited by the steepness of the grades. They don't like to have their dams blown out. So if it's a really steep, fast stream, they're not likely to use that as habitat. So those are my three answers. So Ken or Dana, I don't know if you have any.
Well, and I'm not sure we actually have time to get into the
Okay.
details of responding to each of these. It sounded like, Sue, I'm attentive to the fact that you had another comment you wanted to share, and Francis still has some comments she'd like to make.
Okay.
Sure.
But I would love an answer to that question. Okay.
We're certainly in favor of beaver and would like to see them as part of the larger restoration of
know,
the aquatic
I know
riparian.
everybody's in favor of them, but nobody seems to know if they can be trapped here, there, and everywhere. And I think that's something we need to know, and it needs to be stopped. I'm sorry, but it does. Okay, the other question I have is, Shannon, you had mentioned experiments that would go forth to decide something about the marbled merlets. What kind of experiments are you talking about?
Yes, so that there are details in the research proposal and in the draft HCP, but it's basically a research study on management in extensive areas with high retention, so 80% retention of trees in areas that have been identified by these three databases that Katie was talking about as marbled murrelet habitat. So the details of that are in the research proposal in one of the appendices. And then there are further details being worked on for the forest management plan.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Sue.
you all.
And I would note, Francis, as we transition to you, you can come on camera and off mute. DSL is scheduling, and I think in conjunction with the OSU team, a public meeting and informational session in September, which will be another opportunity for folks to have a bit more time to dig into these topics with the team and ask your questions and hopefully get them answered in a space that allows you a little bit more time for dialogue and discussion on these. So bear that in mind. If you're on the email distribution list for DSL, you'll get notification when that date and time has been set. So make sure that you're looking out for that. All right, great. Francis?
Thank you. You know, on that early implementation watershed map, if there could be a version of that map that had either section lines or major roads on the map, it would be a lot easier to pinpoint specific places that you're talking about, places you want to exchange, or perhaps the trail you want. It would be a whole lot easier to pinpoint stuff if that map was more specific on where things were. And if it would help me if I just either had section lines or major roads. You know, I have a lot of pictures of the Elliott that have that are georeferenced with a lat long. I could place specifically if I had some more information, including pictures of that trail. So would that be possible to get just a little change to that map?
Yeah, I can ask Deanne to give input too. I think one of the challenges that we have with the maps is once you get beyond a certain level of detail, it becomes hard to read anything. I definitely hear you on the roads and section grids. For the purposes of what we were trying to show here, even being able to show additional criteria like the slopes, we had to split it out because you just couldn't see. But there are maps that do show those road networks and some of the other details. And so they are available. We can show them, when it makes sense, and especially to help address your questions too. So I guess the short answer is yes. And we'd be very interested in talking with you a little bit more, particularly about that trail location and Sub-Watershed 95 and any other details that you have as we're trying to locate where those are.
And
I think, just major roads, not the road grid, but just the major roads would help identify places.
And Deanne, if you or Shannon, if you'd be willing to just drop your email address in the chat, that way Frances can get in touch with the team to make sure she can help you with that trail identification, that would be really helpful. Sorry, Frances, for interrupting.
I'm on phone audio, so there's a lag anyway with everybody. So I have a quick question on the monitoring section. We didn't cover that much today, but I did read that monitoring proposal, and I noticed that there was not one word about the marten. And so I was wondering, at what point do we get to know what the no-take protocol is for the marten and how you're going to monitor that no-take protocol? I know last time you said trail cameras, but trail cameras need to be placed for specific species at specific heights. And so there's no description of what is the no-take protocol for coastal martens, which is as important as northern spotted owl, marble murrelet, according to the Endangered Species Act, and how that's going to be monitored.
So one of the sections that we're working on releasing later this week is the species conservation chapter, and there's a section on martens there. We've been working with several different people who have models of coastal marten habitat, as well as having expertise in survey work and monitoring. And so at this stage, the vision for being able to detect martens on the forest as part of that overall monitoring network is through those biodiversity plots that we talked about last time with the cameras, and being sure that they're set to kind of be able to capture small to medium carnivores. That's one of the things that the person who's piloting that project this summer has taken into account. But we're also talking with people who may be interested in doing additional survey work and kind of understanding what the current state of the science is. So there's further details coming later this week on marten, and be happy to talk further once you've had a chance to review that about other details or questions that you have.
Great. And with that, we do need to wrap up. Frances, do you have one final word, comment you'd like to make?
No, that's fine. I'm done.
Okay, you don't have to be done. You can be done for today. And written feedback and suggestions is always welcome. And
oh, I do have one more comment. You mentioned that the HCP was out for public review right now.
I may have
so the link is.
I may have misspoken. I'm not. So it's not. Bob's shaking his head. He's saying no. So it will be. I think it's soon. I'm not involved in that process, but I know that it's yeah, September, I think is yeah, we're about a month out. So
that's what I've heard at least.
All right. I didn't mean to get get anybody in trouble. myself included, or create expectations when they were ill-conceived. So shockwaves. I apologize. Shockwaves were sent. Just one little misstep, and you send shockwaves. Thanks everybody for your time. Thank you to the OSU team for all the time and energy developing the presentation and obviously the work on the FMP. Thanks to the advisory committee members for your work and reviewing the sections and including everything from today and that stuff that's going to come the end of the week in preparation for the advisory committee meeting. So, and for all the members of the public, appreciate your willingness to continue to track this important conversation. With that, meeting's adjourned, and hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thanks.